Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to get this presentation to work. Okay. So this lecture today is an artist's talk. I'll be talking to you about my work and collaborations, and I'll be dissecting apart artifacts I've created for specific people and events. Every new Graduate Diploma cohort since we first started the course, I've given a live dissection. I usually do this in a really large studio space worn by a student. And in fact, somebody told me last year that the next dissection I do would instead be in a small bedroom at my dad's retirement flat in Chichester, having been stuck indoors for 55 days, with no mannequin dummy or model to wear the dress. I'd have thought it a crazy task. But these are quite remarkable times, and I really wanted to find a way to continue the tradition and demonstrate for you special students the dissection of a tunnel dress. So shortly, I'll perform this for you. It will take about 30 minutes, and before and afterwards I'll give you some things to think about when approaching your own artifact project. Afterwards, at the end of it all, I'll tell you about a drawing workshop we're going to do together on Monday the 18th, which connects the idea of dissection, taking apart, deconstruction and reconstruction and mending. So what I want you to think about in this session is what is an artifact, and where is the artifact? Which parts are the artifact, and what others used during its creation or construction. We often focus only on the end piece, the prize, the thing of value and power. But as a fashion clothing maker, I use tools and patterns to construct garments which are also worthy of focus and value, but which are often overlooked. I've invented my own construction methodology called subtraction cutting, which I've taught for over 20 years in 36 countries. I also call it free cutting because I openly share the construction process for free. This has made me a teacher that carries their teaching tools around the world nomadically to demonstrate my craft. So what might free cutting actually look like? And what artifacts are created and used which may be useful to your thinking and practice? So subtraction cutting, here's some examples of it. These are actually created in a studio in Brighton. They weren't made for any particular market or customer. They're just trying out ideas that I then take to classrooms and universities around the world to try and further the technique. And I tend to work in black and white to start with. It's a nice reductionist palette. All of these techniques you see here are called tunnel technique. So when I'm dissecting a part garment from you today, you'll see a similar technique in action deconstructed. I often do this to large audiences too, so in theatres and lecture halls. And so here's a little picture of me on the sort of right-hand side on a stage in a fetal position, all curled up. And next to it is a pattern, and that pattern has a series of holes in it. And that will become something that you'll see during or later on during this dissection, hopefully. The garments on the left-hand side are all made by students who then respond to my initial making so that they can construct their own garments. And each one of them are unique. It involves accidental risk, well, what I call happy accidents and risk-taking. So they wouldn't have known in advance that these would have been the outcomes. And that's the beauty of subtraction cutting, is not quite knowing what the design is until you've walked through the process. So I start first of all with something called Andrew, or a little story about Andrew, because garments are stories about people. And so I want you to sort of see some of the individuals I make clothing for, and how I do that, and what artifacts I use. So this is Andrew. He's 65 years old. He's a classical musician, very, very talented and renowned. And we first of all met. I was actually studying at the Royal College of Art. I was studying my MA in menswear, and I'd made a film, and I asked him whether I could use his music as the soundtrack to that film. And then he got back in touch with me to say, let's have a coffee and meet up. So we then became friends. And later on, time goes by. He then makes the music for my first fashion show at London Fashion Week and plays the piano live. But after that, we begin to sort of like lose contact a bit. We're friends on social networking, but we don't see each other. And then he gets in touch to say that he's creating a new album of music, and he wants 11 artists to make 11 films, each for a track in his album. And so he asked me, would I make a film for his album? And so to do that, I decided I would like to take some measures of Andrew, to measure his body in order to make a garment, a robe for him to wear within a video. Because if I think I'm going to make a video for Andrew, he's a musician, how might I go about that? A garment is an interesting starting point for me, and a garment that he would one day wear and perhaps perform in. So to do that, I need a series of measures of Andrew to start the process off. Rather than using centimetres or inches, I'll instead start from perhaps his own body measurements. So I go to his house and I ask him to lay down, and I draw around his body and around his limbs in order to take a series of measures of his human body. And these are then used during the process of construction for the garment I'm going to make him as referential tools of making. And they are all about not numerics, but musical reach. The reach of his hand across an octave, the reach of his arms across the piano, the posture he might sit in if you're playing a guitar. He has very white flowing hair, the shape of his hair as it lays out on the floor. Because this is a very interesting and important part of his posture when he's actually playing music and talking, when his hair is down, that his hair is part of himself. So I wanted to, as a portrait of Andrew, make sure I would document that in the tools I was making that would be used to make the garment. Then, having taken all these tools, I was then able to use them as measures to construct a garment for Andrew, which I could then consider how I might use that within a video. So this is a little robot version of Andrew, and it includes around his fingers and the length of his body, a cross-section of his torso, his flowing hair laid out. And this is a little sort of almost like robotic version that would be a useful referential tool or measure for making a garment. So I then take 5 meters of poppy red cloth, because his name is Andrew Poppy, and his name therefore signals in my mind the colour red, and it would offset against his white hair rather beautifully. The first act of creation is then to cut into that cloth. And so I decide to cut a Andrew Poppy shaped hole out of 5 meters of red cloth. Now that takes a long time. It goes all around his fingers, his hair. It's a very elaborate shaped hole. Having created a hole, the next act is to mend that hole or to close it. Now if you take a circular hole, a simple shaped hole, and you take one edge of it to the other and you close it in one direction and then close it in the other direction, you will end up with a half moon shaped scar. You can do the same with a very elaborate shaped hole by taking one point of it to another and start closing it in one direction, then closing it in the other direction. You will end up with a very, very elaborate shaped scar. So this is me now closing that hole off so that I'm healing it or sealing it. Takes a very long time to pin together, takes a long time to then hand stitch and machine stitch to get it into a shape such as this one here. Now this shape is a very unusual one because I didn't expect it to happen. It was a happy accident. So this is the body of Andrew Poppy in a cloth shaped, almost like duvet. And it doesn't have a front or a back, and I had to therefore rotate it around. This is actually taken in the room next door where my father is. I'm in my father's house, and we're socially distanced from each other at this particular time. And he's 75 years old, and I didn't have a mannequin dummy, so I asked him, would you put it on? So he's got his hands in the air, and I put it over his body, and I rotate it around him to see how it feels on the body, to see how it sits. And then this is a really good way of me working out the garment, trying to figure out what is the front, what is the back, what angle looks best to me as a garment. Now, from my father's point of view, he doesn't know what the hell's going on. He's inside it, probably thinking he's being reborn or something in some sort of red tube. But he was gladly able to help me for a short while, and it was very useful when you don't have a mannequin to try and use a human body instead. So then, once I'm able to figure out the front, back, side angles, and I know what it might be as a garment, and I've marked it, I can then move on to considering the first cut that would make it into a garment, and that first cut is a neck hole. So it's a bit like a poncho. If you cut a hole into a piece of cloth and put your head through it, it falls onto your shoulders and it's a garment. By the way, my dad's not actually in this garment at this particular moment in time. There's now a mannequin dummy in there, and I'm just considering where the first cut is, and because I know that as soon as that's made, it will fall down onto the shoulders, and then having fallen down onto the shoulders, it becomes garment-like. It becomes a garment that can be occupied. Thereafter, you'd then cut 2 further holes for arms to come out of, and you do that by putting it on a human body, because mannequins don't have arms, and certainly not flexible arms. So you put it on a body, my body, and I would then start to think about Andrew and about his movements and his wear, and I'd be thinking about fittings with Andrew, so I'm imagining Andrew. And this brings a connection between Andrew and myself and our bodies and our movements and the feeling of this garment, how it makes me feel as I put it on. And it's quite historic looking from the back. It looks a little bit sort of ancient and robe-like. Maybe from the front it's quite avant-garde and unusual, and a portrait in many ways of Andrew's body shape, locked in cloth. Then, having fitted it on him, of course, this project isn't about making a garment. It was a project about making a video, and it was a video for a musical track. So we then take it to a beach, a deserted beach, where the tide goes out to expose this empty land. Just as the sun is setting, we've got 1 hour to shoot in this space, and the video is therefore about Andrew in his garment, kind of fidgeting or moving around or responding to it in some way.
I'm singing while the hunting horns blow. I'm singing while the hunting horns blow. There's a lot of huffing, puffing. There's something at the door. There's something at the window.
So that's the Andrew dress, an Andrew dress made from measures cut from his own body, and using units of measure that are about his musical reach. So now this is another dissection, and this is the dissection I'm going to give to you within this space that I'm actually in now. And it's about, it's called the Sissy dress, and the Sissy dress was cut on the 12th of November 2019. Sissy was a Graduate Diploma fashion student, and I made a garment for her at the Garden House Studios for the Royal College of Art. And the garment was made from scratch, built around her body. And so I'm going to show you some of the images of that dress before I cut it apart, before I deconstruct it for you, so that you can see its inner geometry, just that you can understand the story behind it. So on the day I cut it apart in November, this is me, and I'm wearing a blue check shirt. And that check shirt was bought for me by my partner Marie in Singapore after doing a masterclass there. And here I am, looking quite lively. You can see my legs, which is quite rare for Zoom, in the class, cutting and constructing what's called a tunnel dress for Sissy. And it's all based around her measurements and her body, but also it's a very unusual construction technique to learn. Here's Sissy in a nice large space, and me then demonstrating to the class, having made the garment, what the parts of it were like, what was unusual about this garment, walking the students around its geometry and its construction. And so then Sissy takes it and puts it on herself. She brings it to life with her own movements and her own dynamic feeling of wearing. You know, doing what the garment makes her feel like doing. And then this is me in a much larger room than the one I'm about to deconstruct the garment in. The room of construction with the constructed dress. And now this is a shot of the space I'm in right now. And this is the dress that I'm going to be taking apart for you. I've set up cameras from a front view, a back view, and an aerial view, so you can see all around the garment as I cut and construct this. So here we have the Sissy dress, about to be deconstructed, dissected apart. Let's have a little look at it in the round before we take it apart. It's a very soft, structured garment. Here's the name, Sissy, 12th of the 11th, 2019. Each garment gets signed and dated everywhere I go, every garment I make. Here's the circular seam, or the curving seam at the front. It also has this like wormhole in it. It's actually cut from 6 holes. I call it a tunnel dress. You can actually see that it's actually made from something quite angular though, because it has pointed corners. So although it's soft structured, it actually is made from something quite angular. If you look at this wormhole, this sort of outside tunnel, if I put my hand through it, it comes out the other side. This is actually a valley between 2 circles. It's not a hole at all. It's rather a loop. I could climb through it. So here, if we look at the hem, you can see it's actually just like a tunnel inside. It has a series of catacombs and directions that you can travel through. It's hollow. All garments are hollow, others wouldn't be able to get into them. But this one has a series of differential routes that you could travel through. You can see upwards and downwards. So if you look at this curving seam in this front, it's actually made from 2 circles. I'm going to cut this one apart. So I'm going to put a little marker across the line where I'll cut, marked A and A, so that we can then see these points when I deconstruct it. There's also another seam that I'll cut across, another curving seam made from 2 circles, here in the back. And I'll put a mark across that one too, called B to B, 2 reference points that we can later look back at. I'm going to cut this one apart first. This will be the first incision. Now if I rip this seam open, we'll begin to see what shape it makes. It's a curving seam. It's actually 2 circles, both same length, both identical. And the distance around the circle is equal to Sissy's hip dimension. They're cut in pairs with a valley between them. They mirror from one to the other, B to B. And then gravity just falls down. And that was the first cut. The next time I'm going to now cut the armhole. The armhole has a side seam that runs down the side, usually all the way to the hem, but this one ends early. It doesn't reach the hem, it's very short. I'll cut it open. And if I rip this, it actually is not very long, it ends. And it creates a loop. It's a looping side seam. It's quite hard to see up here. It curves from front to back, just underneath the armhole. The next armhole, the next side seam, much longer, it runs down the side. If I rip this one's much longer. And as I open it, we now can see the insides of the garment revealed. As if we had X-ray vision, we can now look inside the garment. But this too is a looping seam. It loops from front to back at the armhole. This opening up of the garment, this dissection, this really allows us to see inside. And the garment begins to disassemble. Its structure is actually much bigger than we think. This hole here on the front. I'll take this one apart next. Hole A to A. This too is a circular hole, so if I rip this one, we'll again see a pair of holes, but this one's between the yellow and the grey spot fabric. It too is a pair of holes, both identical. One equal to the circular circumference of Sissy's hip, matching to its pair on the other side, from yellow to grey. Releasing this really changes its length. It now really expands outwards. We can begin to see this is made from a much larger piece than we might have first thought. we can look down into it and see these catacombs, these holes or roots. And we can look up through the hem, through the tube. I'll take it down now and see if we can actually take apart the rest of it to make it flat. It has a series of holes inside it that have now been released, but these were routes that the body would actually pass through. You can see that the front neckline is deeper than the back. I'm now going to release the shoulders, slice through them. So they separate, front and back, then on the other side. Now the front and the back are separated from each other. The garment now drifts further apart. We can now see what shape this is. Get a better feeling of what it was made from originally. It's like a duvet, a rectangle. 2 equal length pieces of fabric, one yellow, one grey. With an opening one end to get into and close at the other end, where the points are. And then a series of holes that are cut into the surface, some of which through the body moves. There's not much more to this garment than holes. So now let's make this two-dimensional. Here's the hem. This is where you get into the garment. This is actually the first cut. It's usually cut by the person in the shop who gives me the fabric. If I open this last seam, this is the selvage seam, the long outer edge of the woven cloth. If I rip this apart, then we reach the short, straight edge, and by releasing this, it suddenly becomes two-dimensional. The three-dimensional garment has now become the two-dimensional pattern. It's big. It's bigger than the room I'm in. I'll lay it down. Because now gravity must take effect, and we can only view this from above, from a bird's eye view. This is the viewpoint I use when I design the pattern. I work from above, from an aerial angle looking down. But my thought processes move through other orientations too. Elevated viewpoints, bird's eye views and worm's eye views. But I don't know what the pattern looks like until I see it for the first time when it's laid out as it is now. Because until now it was simply the process of cutting. When I made it for Sissy, I was cutting it around her and making a garment for her to wear. But then when it was constructed, I didn't know what it would look like in 2D. But now I can see for the first time what it looks like. It's bigger than this room I'm in, but I can still show you the holes. I can show you their arrangement. Usually I work in so much bigger spaces, but it's an interesting challenge to see it now. So let's take these little patterns here as shaper patterns. I use them to construct the fronts and backs of the top of the garment. Here's the back. Actually, I'll show them to you. So here they are, separated, the back, the front. The back goes behind the front, and the front has a deeper V neckline. And they are joined at the shoulder. But if you peel them away and separate them, you can see them from an aerial bird's eye view. And if we lay this onto the cloth, in their position, we can see their relationship to each other. They're not separated, they've been joined by the side seams. Side seams being curving. A small curve on one side that I cut apart first, and then on the other side a much longer curve that swoops around to join and unite the two side seams. And that curve is equal to my wrist curve, because I drew it by hand. And sometimes it's equal to my shoulder curve. It's a much bigger swooping curve. So these are human measurements, these are human representations of my body drawing the pattern into the cloth. I'm present within the work. This is the circular circumference dimension around Sissy, equal to her hip measurement. And these patterns have a relationship with each other. Hole A joined over in a mirror form to hole A. One was in yellow, one was in grey, and that was the seam at the top of the garment that I split open last of all. A to A. And then the very first hole I cut apart was a pair of circles down the bottom on the back, B to B, mirrors of each other with a valley in between. So if we count these holes, here we have the very first hole, which incorporates the neck and the armhole, hole 1. And here's 2, which is A to A, that's 2 and 3. And then B to B is 4 and 5. 5 holes. 5 holes. But actually it's a 6-hole dress. Where's the 6th hole? The 6th hole is the hem, the bottom of the dress, which is a singular line cut by the person who sold me the fabric, a 6-hole tunnel dress. Made from nothing but 6 holes. Thank you. So now let's think about the artefacts here and what constitutes them. The artefact is first of all the most recognisable as being a dress that I cut and made live for Sissy. The dress as worn by her and designed. However, that's only part of the real story. The artefact is also the object no longer worn by Sissy 6 months later in a changed world, being dissected apart to reveal its geometric template pattern. The garment pattern is a tool of construction and is also an artefact. Then, when we observe and dissect further these 2D fabric remnants, we see other important tools used in the process. The shaper pattern for the front and back, necks, and the circular hole patterns which were made to Sissy's dimensions. These tools and the scissors that were used were all vital artefacts of construction. The tools shape the garment's form, but so too does my body. I measure distances and draw lines using gestural marks which derive from my body. My body is in the pattern, and you just witnessed me performing a dissection using it. So the artefact is also a certain type of performative craft, a methodology of making. And there's also a bag there filled with educational tools and props that traverse the globe with me, which help communicate and pass on the construction process to others through teaching. So this is the paper pattern of Andrew's arm, one of the measures that were used to construct the garment for him, and also a little sort of tape measure that I fashioned myself in order that I could take dimensions around his limbs, around his arms, around his waist, his torso, to create a sense of what his lengths might be. And this is just made from a little taped up piece of paper, and then signed by Andrew to authenticate it. And then this is the garment pattern for Sissy's dress, the one that I just deconstructed apart. If you were to draw around this piece of cloth and to make a paper pattern from it, or a digital pattern, it could be put into production. You could use it as a cookie cutter to construct many other dresses. This is the bag that I take around the world when I'm teaching these techniques to others. It's filled with all my artefacts, my teaching artefacts, my props, and it's bought from a bookshop called This Is Alice in Bondi Beach in Australia. Here we are. And within the bag are a series of important props and tools that help communicate the technique to others so that they can understand it and follow it and mimic it and try it out and collaborate with me, so that the technique continues beyond my own practice. The paper templates that are made, the circular ones, are usually unique to each person I make a garment for. So Sissy would have had a paper pattern constructed to exactly a hip circumference measure, and I would have then signed it and dated it and given it to her as a sort of present, a bit like a sort of certificate, having had a garment made for her. And these paper patterns get drawn onto and changed and adapted during the process of construction. These are the shaper templates for the front and back of the top part of the dress that I used when I was deconstructing it, and also when I was making the garment for Sissy. And because they get used and shown to others and used by people around the world, they have little markings upon them, such as finger markings, little drawings around the fingers. And these are because we use our bodies as a referential marking tool, as a almost like a measure. And so it becomes quite a useful measure, using finger widths and hand spans and arm lengths when constructing garments for people. These are paper patterns that are used to sort of explain the folding of construction holes and their pairing together, and this idea of a valley fold between them, a symmetry between them, a relationship. And these are very useful for explaining to people how the technique works, so that they can understand it, so they get a better notion of it, so that they can then try these techniques out themselves in their own manner and make it part of their own working methodology, so that the techniques get absorbed into their own thinking and way of working. And they get very much damaged over time. They get they get mended and fixed. This is the scissor that I used to cut the Sissy dress in the first place, and then to deconstruct it again. It's a Japanese steel scissor, and a very useful artefact tool I used during the process of making. This is the blue shirt I wore when I constructed the dress for Sissy. It was part of that moment, of that time, and it was bought for me by Marie, who I was doing a masterclass within Singapore while we were there. This is the t-shirt I wore underneath it, and also the t-shirt I decide to wear today to deconstruct it in. And it's an important part of that moment and that time, and it's also got some markings and some paint markings and dyes upon it that came from a time where Marie and myself were in Brighton just before the lockdown, and we were making sketchbooks together, and that sketchbook activity of drawing together and painting and mark making became impressed on our skin and therefore wiped on our t-shirts, and it changed that garment, and that garment is now changed by that activity. So this thing of drawing and cutting and making and all the tools that we use and all the artifacts along the way become kind of referential and connected to each other. And all of these were created in Brighton, where we were at the time just before the lockdown. So what I'd like you to consider is how the artifacts you've chosen for your project became made, what tools crafted them, what's inside them, what methodologies and lives touched them, and how might these be exposed. So let's just for a moment run this all backwards in time-lapse to see the Sissy dress remade just one final time, just to remind ourselves of all the artifacts at work here.